This session is from ASF's 2024 conference at RMIT Melbourne with Maryanne Demasi, David Southwell, Andrew Lowenthal, Brian Shrowder and Rebekah Barnett.
Rebekah is an independent journalist, fellow at Brownstone Institute and advocate for Australians injured by the COVID vaccines. She holds a BA in Communications from the University of Western Australia and publishes on her Substack, Dystopian. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel today. We've got a mix of independent and mainstream people here. So I'll start with, we've got Maryanne Demasi here, who many of you know is a medical scientist with a PhD in rheumatology. She worked as a TV journalist for the ABC and Channel 7, had a popular show called Catalyst, and then threatened big industry interests a little bit, and that career ended all of a sudden, which Maryanne a lot of you know Maryanne's story, but she'll touch on that today. She did, though, before big industry came after her, win the National Press Club Prize 3 times for excellence in health journalism. So I don't think her journalism was the and she's also a fellow at Brownstone, like me, and she publishes on Substack with Maryanne Demasi Reports. And she publishes for the BMJ as well. All right, we've got Brian Shrowder. So Brian works in reputation in the corporate sphere. So like PR, but more in depth is how you were explaining it to me.
The sharp end of PR.
Yeah, the sharp end of PR. Okay, I like that. So Brian's a former broadcast journalist as well, worked at ABC and 10 as a exec, and has worked with top companies like Amazon, Samsung, Shell, Disney, Volkswagen, and basically helps organizations to define their position and their message. So some tips for people here and perhaps ASF today. And then we've got David Southwell. David is a journalist at the Daily Mail, has worked over 20 years in the media, has worked for local papers, he's worked for the AAP wire service and news. This is cute. Your best job was morning tea correspondent for the Balmain Village Voice.
By far.
What did that involve?
Covering morning teas. So
I
found my natural métier in going out to morning teas. I established that bureau and very diligently.
And top morning tea ever?
Sorry?
What was the top morning tea?
You generally wanted something like the Country Women's Association.
Right, scones,
like
lamingtons.
So
you're partial.
I'm pretty traditionalist in my morning tea.
You're partial to a bake. Okay. And then we've got Andrew Lowenthal at the end, who, again, another Brownstone fellow. Andrew is in the independent media space. So Andrew has a Substack called Network Effects and has worked with Matt Taibbi on the Twitter files. Most of the time, I'd say you're director for liber-net and founder of liber-net, which is a digital rights NGO. And previously, Andrew I think you co-founded that one as well and directed a similar organisation in Southeast Asia, is that right? Called. But this is what I think is very interesting about you, Andrew. He was working in Southeast Asia to protect digital rights and then observed that, over in the West, where we thought we had it all sorted, wasn't so sorted anymore, and so now has turned his efforts back into home ground, which was sort of like the beacon of how to do things and no longer is. Would you say that's correct?
Hello. Maybe not always 100% great over in the West, but definitely was mostly better than the regimes that I was kind of working with people in. Now, not so much, but watch this space.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to start, the way this is going to go today, I've got so many questions I want to ask these guys, and we're just going to have a a loose discussion, and then for the last half hour or so, I'll throw out to you guys to ask questions. So if you jot them down, you'll get an opportunity to ask it towards the end. So I actually, I thought I might start with you, Brian, because there's a lot of people here, we've heard that some stories already, who've been cancelled or have been harassed publicly, and we'll hear about Maryanne's experience in a bit. Can you tell us a bit more about reputation management, what that involves and why it's important?
For sure, and for anybody in that position, and I know Maryanne, Gigi, you've been, it's incredibly difficult. But there are strategies that you can adopt, and one of the things I think that and now talking more broadly around this community and this group, is anyone of public advocacy and policy has a message to tell. And the way it works is you don't just tell the message, you have to sell it. And right now, it was really interesting listening to Russell's rousing finish at the end of the last session. There's likely to be an opportunity with the Australian public right now for the public to be a little bit more receptive, and the hint of change in the air, that you have a public that may be willing to hear what you have to say, but you have to land those messages in a way that will connect. What are the things that, of course, all Australians will agree with? And then being really sharply focused on the policy outcomes that you are looking for. And that's one of the things I think that might be worth thinking about. The clear, defined policy outcomes you're looking for. And I think the way that you connect with the public now is not looking back to what happened in 2020, 21, but looking forward to what happens if this, or when it's going to happen next. How are we going to do it differently? How are we going to avoid, still manage an outcome, but avoid the gross economic and social harm that came along the way? By defining who you are and what you are for, you're also making it very clear what you want. And by doing so, you're not going to make yourself immune from abuse or name calling, but you have a clear position to say, we are not that, or I am not that. This is what we are looking for. The other thing to say is there's an enormous amount of credibility in this room. This is a room full of people with medical science backgrounds, lawyers, people who are genuine experts in your field. One of my suggestions would be really is the expertise that you have, the credibility that you bring to this debate, and make sure, and I know Gigi's done a lot of this with your modelling, make sure that what you say is backed up as far as possible with some data points, with some stories. When you're selling media, you need something that sits behind the message. When you think about media and the way it works is, David, I'm sure you'll agree, it's as much entertainment as it is a information dissemination system, to the extent that it very often may not even be that in terms of disseminating. So what are the other things that you need to add to your arsenal, as well as clear, focused messaging, to be able to make it receptive when you're pitching to media? We'll probably get that onto that as well too. But also when you're managing attacks from that they're going to be your opponents. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you. So speaking of attacks, Maryanne, perhaps you could just do a recap of your story. Anyone who was at ASF last year will be familiar with Maryanne's story, but we'll just do the cliff notes for anyone who wasn't here. It'd be interesting maybe to just ask Brian what might have been good to have done differently, that perhaps anyone who then is facing a similar situation in the future. Hopefully they won't, but that, might provide some pointers.
Yeah. After finishing my PhD, I worked very briefly in politics as a political advisor and speechwriter for the Science Minister. And then within a day or two, I got 2 job offers, originally from Adelaide, to move to Sydney to work for either Channel 7's Beyond, the program was at the time. I think that was the ABC, Beyond 2000, or was the original? Yeah.
She was my boss for a
Oh,
while.
right. So it was either that or work for Catalyst at the ABC. And 20 years ago, the ABC was a very respected broadcaster. Everybody wanted to work there. It had integrity, editorial policies, and it wasn't a difficult decision for me, thinking long term about where I wanted to be in 10 years' time. So I chose the ABC, and there was a real steep learning curve for the first few years until I really started understanding the power of my platform, being able to speak to a national audience. I really started to dig down in stories. I became very investigative in the work that I was doing, and that's kind of where the more you dig, the more controversial it becomes and the more trouble you get into. So it's one of my very first stories I remember was about the dangers of sugar, and it doesn't seem controversial now, but back in those days, I think it was maybe only Sarah who was talking about the perils of too much sugar, and I did a documentary about too much sugar in the diet, and the sugarcane industry came out really strongly the next day. They put out newsletters, they were all over radio saying, this was an oversight by Catalyst, they've missed the mark this time, a usually reputable program has lost its way. And I thought, gee, that's strange, but nobody really panicked too much about it. The next 2 documentaries that I made was a 2-part series looking at the role of cholesterol in heart disease. And the first part was about diet, nutrition, and lifestyle. The second was about the overprescription of cholesterol-lowering medications called statins. And really all we said was that there is a subclass of people that need these drugs, but the vast majority of people that are on them are in the low-risk category and probably should, because cholesterol is not central to the development of heart disease. We had Harvard professors, we had the editor-in-chief of JAMA Internal Medicine. We interviewed, reputable people, and there was just such outrage after those programs went to air. The 3 statin manufacturers wrote to the ABC. We had cardiologists coming out saying, if you know anyone that watched this program and went off their medications, we want you to sue the ABC. So the ABC got very nervous about this, and I had to undergo a 6-month investigation to look at all of the facts, all my facts in place, and we had dedicated a website with extra interviews and all the medical journals. And then without warning, the ABC came out saying both programs were factually accurate, but some of it was unbalanced, so we're going to censor the programs. And it was the first program that we ever had a banning of programs at the ABC.
Just to say, that reminds me of Catherine Mars saying Wikipedia can't be accurate, can't be factually accurate, because that might mean it's it's biased in some way. And then You've got organizations saying, these days, particularly since Trump. Was this after Trump or before, by the way?
This was before. So it was 2013.
Right. So this was before, yeah. But then you've got New York Times and WAPO and various others sort of saying, well, we can't report factually accurately because they vote incorrectly or whatever. And so we had the standard shift in journalism away from factual accuracy, because that's perceived as creating bias in people towards outcomes that are undesirable, essentially. So
it was difficult to be balanced all the time, and if you were promoting the established view, they didn't worry that you didn't have balance in a program that was talking about the benefits of vaccine. They didn't expect you to interview anti-vaxxers. I hate that term, sorry, but that's what they called them. Or you don't interview a climate change denialist in a story about. So they're quite happy to have this false balance in establishment ideas, but when you're challenging the establishment, it's very different. So we proceeded I had a choice. I could rebel and say this is not good enough, the ABC is not standing by me. I had a lot of journalists in the background writing to me saying, we support you, but we just can't say anything because then it's their job's on the line. So we decided we'd just put our heads down and for the next few years just continue to do the frank and fearless journalism that they said that we could do. But each time it was worse and worse, and then I would end up in the paper all the time, and she, why is she still there? I had the head of the Dietary Guidelines Committee calling for my sacking. I even had some of my own colleagues, Paul Barry on Media Watch, asking why the ABC hadn't sacked me. So it was just a really difficult environment to work in. And we did stories about, attacking big food, big pharma, big chemicals, big telcos. In the end, I think we spent so much time defending programs. We just didn't have the resources anymore to make the programs because we spent so much time defending them. And I was to defend myself, so this is why it's interesting to hear what Brian has to say. The ABC put a gag order on me and said that in the email they said that if I spoke privately or publicly to anybody about what was going on within the ABC, it would be seen as a breach in my contract. So made me really quite weak in the media. And then even after, well, if you're not defending yourself, it just really leaves the airtime for the people attacking you. And I had cardiologists who were willing to write opinion pieces in the Sydney Morning Herald saying, no, actually, what she was saying was correct, and they would only ever publish the criticisms from the Heart Foundation, all of the organisations that were attacked in my program. So even the media locked up. It was very hard to get defence out. Eventually, the ABC, they were doing a remodelling and they cancelled the program essentially, and they brought it back the next year with all new presenters, and it was basically wanted to get rid of that model, and they wanted to get rid of me. So, but the agony didn't stop for me. I continued to be accused of misconduct. I had legal battles to deal with for years afterwards, and also in those legal battles, I was told by my legal team not to say anything. You don't want to influence the outcomes of the tribunal. It's usual for the lawyers to be quite conservative in terms of defending yourself, so I just had to stay silent for years and years and years. And when it was finally all over in 2018 and I was fully exonerated of all the allegations that were made against me, nobody wanted to run a story. Nobody was interested in the story that went away quickly. So just listening to what Brian was saying during that time, super stressful, lots of tears, lots of sleepless nights. I did approach a couple of crisis management PR agencies trying to get some advice on how I could restore credibility because it was just following me, and I couldn't get work. And I was told that it was, I'm in the eye of the storm. Just wait a year or two till it all settles down and then come back to us. And it was like, I need your help now.
Good advice, Brian.
Look, sometimes, and actually it's true that frequently keeping your head down, not making things worse, is not a bad available strategy. But when you're getting hammered like that continually, putting your head up, airing your position, and you can do it in the politest way. I'm disappointed to hear this being said. But being very clear about, in your case, I had, some of the world's best scientists and best experts in this field contributing to my story, and we did the best available research. what happened to you in the end is part and parcel of the dynamic of media. The world moves on, you get cleared, tick of approval, try and tell that through the media because the world's changed. Yeah, definitely in your case, being able to say something at the time and being on the record for having said it. I think you were poorly advised by both the lawyers and also the crisis PR managers. Frequently these days you will now see lawyers willingly and openly engage in public relations tactics to advance a client's case. And you'll also see, I would not be shy of engaging lawyers as part of a reputation management strategy as well too.
I see the merit in a scandal or a drug scandal. I see the merit in kind of keeping your head down and trying not to inflame the situation, but I really hadn't done anything wrong except do my job as a journalist, and that's where I look back now and I think, ugh, why was I so silly? I was so vulnerable.
Yeah, you had opportunities that as a result of that advice, you had opportunities to get a case across that you missed. So one of the things in terms of crisis management is thinking through what are the available strategies and what is potentially the best and the worst outcomes strategy. And it's like sitting down and weighing up the pros and cons. And actually, unless you go through that exercise, it doesn't need to take very long, but unless you go through that exercise, you may have inadvertently hobbled your ability to respond effectively.
It's interesting, the language that you used is more, I'm disappointed, you're taking the moral high ground, rather than saying, I'm not that, I didn't do that, which can be quite...
to hear somebody say, I actually used that last week for an organisation. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's quite intuitive to get defensive when someone labels you something that you're not. You want to say, I'm not that. The language you're using is more of you're owning the conversation.
You never repeat the negative, so that as soon as you have to say I'm not X, then of course
you are X.
You're X. You're inevitably associated with that thing that's X. Yes, exactly.
So, building on what Maryanne said about how when you were cleared, no one wanted to cover it, that would be a good segue, and we might go to David, but also feel free to chime in. Can you tell us how in mainstream news it is decided what will and won't be reported? How does that news agenda get set?
Firstly, while I was sitting out there, I know we're near the... there's been a shocking omission today, and I think you should all be quite ashamed of yourselves, so I'm going to step in now. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, the CFMEU. And I would like to pay tribute to their senior patched biking members, past and present.
And future.
So I'm glad I got that off my chest. How do news organisations decide what to cover? I was thinking I might talk generally more specifically about the COVID period, where actually I wasn't at the Mail during the main maelstrom of it, but I joined shortly after. And I asked an editor who's more of our mindset, if I want to put it that way, why is it that everyone just fell into lockstep? Because, there was a report out recently, which obviously had to go at all the state governments, rather surreptitiously, even though, it was a little disingenuous because basically have a go at the state governments to say we need a new CDC in Canberra, because the solution to government failure is always more government. I saw all the media jump up and down, and of course, that's great, the government did this, and I thought, well, where's our mere? We were the cheerleaders. I say us as the media. We were the cheerleaders. we didn't question most of these things. And in fact, quite often I saw press conferences where journalists, instead of questioning, the measures that were being taken, they would be asking for stronger measures. I would regard the COVID period as a disastrous period for Australian media, where we completely failed in the one thing that journalist lecturers will tell you the media should be doing, and that's speaking truth to power. And during the COVID period and in many other cases, what the media actually does is speak power to truth. So I asked one of our editors, because I'm just a grunt, really. I cover morning teas and write stories about like the Queen after she died. I didn't actually write that story, but it did feature on Media Watch.
And you do headlines in caps locks.
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't write the headlines. I used to write headlines, but I don't write the Daily Mail headlines. So he gave me sort of 4 factors. So one was, yes, the government did ring up directly to make sure that the Mail towed the line. So Greg Hunt and others rang our editors directly, and if we ran something they didn't like, our editor would hear, yes, there was direct government pressure. But the second, I'd say, pincer, or the most important other way of controlling the narrative, was social media. Because now most digital platforms, or all digital platforms actually, rely on social media for their traffic. And if you stepped away from the accepted narrative, you might get a strike, or you might just get moved down in the algorithm. So most media outlets would toe the line just for commercial reasons. And the other reason why you want to keep the government on side is because the government is now the only thing that can stand between our media and all the losses that we make, and trying to recoup some of that from Facebook or whatever platform it is. So we want we want the government to be muscling up them to revenue share. So we can't get too offside with the government. He said with 2 other factors. He said, all 4, if maybe any one of these factors had been out of whack, maybe the Mail could have diverged a little bit, but they're all basically in line. So the Mail is a UK paper, but we have a website in Australia, a bit like The Guardian, but we're the anti-Guardian, really. The Guardian being left-leaning and the Mail being sort of right populist. So London apparently gave the orders that, we had to toe the line as far as COVID goes. He did say is to the readership. Through most of the COVID period, he thought people would get sick of restrictions before they did, but actually the readership was generally quite rabid. So, if the readership had been else, the Mail would have probably followed, albeit that the government and social media were very powerful things in keeping the narrative. But in general, as we've just heard with Maryanne, the media works as a pack, and your peers are doing for editors and journalists. There's many of them who, in my opinion, they write and edit for each other. So, when I've been in trouble, when I got in trouble with our previous editor, who was very vehemently anti-vax, stories to him, and he would just bark out over the newsroom, "We're not doing that. That's an anti-vaxxer story." And that was an awfully good impression, by the way. That's exactly what he sounded like. When I got into, he pulled me in once and he said, "Well, what are you saying on Twitter, saying this and that about this nutty guy you've got working there?" And I thought that was quite telling. His friends. That's what he was concerned about. And media people are concerned about what other media. I think we had that point earlier today about academics or lawyers. You don't want to. And terms like and cooker are very powerful propaganda PR tools. And all you have to do is just employ a whiff of that. You know, you're an anti-vax. The ABC today, background briefing, has done a pretty fair job of vaccine injury. Done a big story. But still, there's all this thing, they're not anti-vaxxers, they're not, it's
they
like
actually put vaccine injury in inverted commas. Yeah. They said the vaccine injured, as though it's not, that it's just what they call themselves. Yeah. But you're right, it was, BC goes, it was a good article. But
well, they are studying, in that sense, media sort of, they're like seagulls with a chip. Once one starts to move one way, the rest start to move that way. And I can see cracks opening, and I guess gone now, so they can sort of revisit a little bit the main pressure of it. But, those are essentially, I think, the factors that were at play. But, the other factor is most of the journalists were subject to the propaganda as well. Most of them believe. So, my last editor, he definitely just believed it. And my current news editor, when I got offside with him over another vax story, he got me in a room and said, I've had 6 vaccines and it hasn't hurt me. And I mumbled, well, give it time.
Now he's dead.
Yes, he died yesterday. So, they're no more immune. And I think in some ways, journalists have become much more conformist because last couple of decades, they're much more likely to come through universities. And previously, journalism was generally a trade, which you entered at a low level and got coffees, and I think it is a trade. It's not actually something that should be taught at universities. And people who come out of the university system are obviously indoctrinated, as we all know from the education seminar this morning. And I also think they have an unhealthy regard for experts, because that's what universities teach you, to respect experts. And, an editor recently admitted I was right about a story which I liked, but I realised, he only said that because some other expert came out and said it. Until it had that it wasn't enough that I'd gathered, the evidence and showed that this was the case. It was because some said it, and then, he's right. So, I think those are some of the factors why the media is lockstep and protected the narrative.
So just on that, you said that the media moves in packs. I had that experience towards the last few years of my time at the ABC. When I first started in journalism, it was a really competitive environment. Like, we were competing with the other TV stations to get the first story, get the best expert, and get the most unique story. And then towards the end, the ABC was like, maybe it's too early to do that story. Let's not do that story yet. And it was only when 2 or 3 other people or had seen it in the Sydney Morning Herald that they were prepared to run a story. So being ahead of the curve and getting a lot of criticism really put them off doing stories. You also mentioned how did they all lockstep with each other. I was shocked when it was pointed out to me that the ABC signed up to the Trusted News Initiative, which was a coalition of big tech and media platforms to all kind of sing from the same song sheet. So that was another thing. And just lastly, the problem with the ABC is that it's a wholly government-funded organisation, and throughout the pandemic, the government's COVID policies the ABC essentially became the propaganda arm for the government. And why would they go against the government and hold the government to account when there comes from the government? It's all just screwed up.
They were a state broadcaster rather than a public broadcaster.
So I heard you say, Andrew, on a podcast that you had observed a cultural shift from people wanting to interrogate. We would interrogate upwards, the powerful, so corporations and government, and that there's been a shift. And I don't know if you're talking about the whole culture or academia, so you can clarify this. There's been a shift to wanting to interrogate the little guy. So you were talking about the Twitter files. In the Australian example, the Department of Home Affairs had flagged posts by accounts with 20 followers saying, you know, you might want to take this down for violating, you know, terms of service. Can you expand on that? And if the Westminster Declaration is relevant to that, feel free to riff into that.
Yeah, so the context was really looking at the kind of mis and disinformation and the fact-checking industry, which is obviously an entirely new field that used to happen inside media organizations themselves, and essentially this change where, you know, the reporting used to be, you know, on the people who had the most power and influence in the people that the media wanted to focus on, rightly, because they were the people who had the most, you know, influence and impact on society. So that should be where the emphasis is. What has changed, obviously, partly because of social media, but also I think was artificially enhanced. Was through the mis and disinformation. The fact-checking industry was going, well, actually, we're not going to fact-check Pfizer on, you know, 95% effective or whatever it might be. We're going to fact-check. I mean, the example that you cite was something that we found in the Australian Twitter files, where there was someone who appeared on Twitter as a doctor. They didn't respond to direct messages. They had 20 followers, and the Department of Home Affairs flagged their tweet to Twitter to say you should check this against your terms of service, because he suggested that steroids, which ended up being used, might be helpful in the treatment of COVID. So again, whatever or not, he could have said, you know, drink this snake venom, 5G, blah, blah, blah. For me, it doesn't matter. It's like, what is the Department of Home Affairs doing? Why does Twitter care that someone with 20 followers is, you know, what they have to say? No one's listening to them. And if they were saying ridiculous, people also probably aren't going to be listening to them anyway. So there's also this, I guess, broader cultural shift that has happened that, you know, with the kind of peer-to-peer policing online, with people kind of, obviously it's related to the cancel culture and everything else, but it was something that the fact-checking industry weaponized, essentially in the service of, I mean, in some ways I think these things are PR operations in many respects. It's like,
as in the fact-checking organizations?
Yeah. I mean, that actually what this is like PR agencies going out and I mean, I'm not kind of citing a direct example. We're going to do PR in the 21st century. I think fact-checking and anti-misinformation is one of the things that looks like. And actually one thing that was never actually published in the Twitter files, but one of the things that looking through that I saw was actually people who were doing PR for Black Panther, the film Black Panther, who had been writing to Twitter because they didn't like some of the things that people were saying about the film, which is obviously, like, you can say whatever you want about a film. I guess you could potentially misrepresent something in the film, and I guess sometimes it wasn't that there were negative comments that they didn't like. And it's like, well, it's basically brand reputation management, essentially. And one of the mechanisms to do it is through this fact-checking and anti-misinformation type work. So I think that's where it's coming from. But the strange journalists and other institutions, like the kind of, what you mentioned, digital rights or the digital free expression world, which is where I came out of, kind of essentially bought into this, where it used to be about, you know, David versus Goliath, we're David, they're Goliath. And now it became essentially, well, actually, we're just going to swap sides. So I think the other David, you David, swap sides, and actually we're going to work with Goliath and turn on the people, which is, and this inversion, again, it wasn't entirely organic. We can talk about the role of thpart like the Department of Homeland Security in the kind of fact-checking and anti-misinformation work, and the cutouts essentially that were in part created by them during the pandemic. But also in some ways it is organic, and this weird flip where people just decided, oh, I'm going to join the mob, I'm going to join the power, I'm going to go people these anti-vaxxers, these cookers, or whatever it might be. And that's, that's going to make the world a bit better place. It makes me keep thinking of the children in 1984 who go around and kind of report on are encouraged to report on their parents if they're like straying from the party line.
Okay, so I'm thinking in our last time with me asking questions, we've talked a little bit about the problem and the way things are. Maybe we could talk about solutions or how we'd like things to be. So I might stay with you. Were involved in creating the Westminster Declaration. Do you want to tell us about that and what we're hoping to achieve with that? And through liber-net, you also have written a policy paper for, I believe, how to handle the issue of on social media, how the US government might look at that. Perhaps you could give us some insights from that as well.
Sure. So the Westminster Declaration was an initiative created by myself with Michael Schellenberger, who's one of the Twitter Files journalists, through a meeting that happened in Westminster at Unheard, that essentially built a coalition of people who wanted to create a kind of free speech manifesto for the 21st century, you could call it. So essentially, we'll have to kind of go through, and I wasn't ready with kind of reciting specific parts of the manifesto. Screen. There are about 25 to 30 different points in there about, open dialogue, free inquiry, weaponization of fact-checking and anti-disinformation to shut down debate, the kind of new respect and new culture that's required. And that was signed by quite a lot of from both the left and the right, from a kind of Jordan Peterson to a Slavoj Žižek to a John McWhorter to an Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, etc. So there is a kind of, I hope that one of the things that produced was a kind of template, or at least a kind of guide of what things might look like at a kind of larger philosophical level. More specifically to the second point, one of the things we just put out was a white paper essentially about how the new administration could go about the censorship industrial complex, a lot of which is actually quite easy because it's just about defunding from the government, at least for the government money, which really runs into hundreds, if not billions, of dollars. One of the things we discovered was actually a something $1 million grant, almost $1 billion, to an outfit called Peraton, a military contract from the Pentagon to combat mis and disinformation. So this is actually the scale of like how much money is going into these systems, but there's also plenty of, $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, $10 million grants that were going through the National Science or other CSA, Department of Homeland Security, etc., to combat mis and disinformation. And the first thing really is just to cut off all of those funds, particularly for any initiative that was doing content flagging, because it's essentially a First Amendment violation. So I think you're going to see people have touched on it a little bit, but I was just in the US, as was Rebekah, and was there during the election, and the excitement is pretty amazing. I would say I think those ripples are. I don't want to get too excited. Sometimes frustrating, as I'm sure everyone here has experienced as well, but at least some of those ripples are surely going to land here when you have a RFK leading Health and Human Services, and a lot of the censorship is going to get weeded out. A huge amount of the conversation is going to open up. Of course, here there'll be a lot of like, oh, it's just Trump crazy, et cetera, et cetera. But I think people will get tired of that eventually, and I think there are more and more curious and inquisitive people who actually want to go, well, what actually is RFK's proposal? Oh, he wants chemicals out of food. That's please explain why we need more chemicals in our food. So I really think the worm has turned dramatically in a way that actually I wouldn't have imagined even 6 months ago at all, and seeing some of these appointments, not all of them I like, but some of them are just incredible. And again, not to get hopes up, but I think it is. I think Russell was also mentioning as well. Like it is really a moment, I think, to kind of go on offense. The winds have turned. We have a tailwind now, not a headwind. So I think we should really feel extremely encouraged.
Yeah. David, I'd like to know from you, I mean, there's a lot of stories in this room that haven't been told in the mainstream. It's just closed doors, they don't want to know. What would you suggest to people wanting to pitch a story to a mainstream news outlet? How to present that information, how to make that approach in such a way that it might get through?
Well, there's no guarantee it'll get through because most journalists or news editors' inboxes are full of pitches, and most of them are from PR agencies. So, it's very easy for stuff to get lost. I think Brian touched on this a little bit, that, you need to know what your story is. So, in general, what journalists are looking for is a hook, something that will immediately grab a reader's attention. So, to present a long email or letter of arguments or statistics or a furious rant or indignation, all those things are pretty unlikely to work. Most journalists are quite lazy. You should keep it short. You should keep it pithy. Whatever you think is the best hook, and by a hook in general, people make the best stories. So you need to find the best thing. If you've got something in general, find someone who can talk about it, or if it's you, bring yourself out to the fore.
Actually, just on that, so a good example would be the paper that UNSW and Coverse collaborated on, showing the administrative burden of the COVID vaccine claim scheme. That a lot of you've probably seen the paper, but saw news.com write it, was they found a guy who's been through that experience and he was the lead.
Yes.
But the story was about the paper, but the paper wasn't the lead.
Yes. So, so you're best off finding a personal story, and if it is, be personal, be short and sharp, put what you think is the most dramatic thing in the subject headline. I mean, if you're a little bit more skilled, you could try and write it like a press release. And generally, a press release is like a short news article, because if a journalist can see something that they can and put their byline to. When I was young, my grandparents had a 60th anniversary, and I wrote my first ever press release. I sent it to the Canberra Times, and they ran it. They ran it verbatim. But the journo put his name on it, and I was quite. Oh yeah, this got in the paper. And the other way, but it's under his name. So yes. So the less work you give to the journo in actually trying to find the story, the better.
Brian, you've already given us some thoughts on the workshop tomorrow, but maybe could you just expand on being on the front foot? Like, what are things that organisations and people can do to be on the front foot with messaging rather than waiting for the accusation or the crisis to come?
I was just listening to Andrew, you talking about...
and hold your mic up.
Hold the mic closer, exactly. Good tip. So Andrew, you were talking about fact-checking that, the Goliath, fact-checking the Davids. And an awful lot of fact-checking that goes on amongst corporations and in the PR industry in Australia. There's lots being spent every day on media monitoring services. Part of it is almost thinking like a PR organisation or taking a communications-driven approach. And that means getting the messaging crystal clear and being able, when asked, you can say in great clarity exactly what your position is. When you're selling a story, David's absolutely right. You get to the point as quickly as you possibly can.
3 words you said, didn't you?
Oh yeah, so the 3 word. So everybody, and every organisation in the world gets labelled with like a 3 words that appear before your name.
Apparently, Maryanne, commercial ABC journalist.
Yeah.
That's your label.
Morning tea correspondent.
Exactly.
Right-wing anti-vaxxer. So,
Yeah.
but
You know,
the point you're making is define your own 3 words.
define your
and
what's
use
your
it
label?
everywhere.
Get that right first, and then think about from a campaigning point of view, what would a campaign look like on this particular issue? When are you going to take certain actions in terms of pitching a story or approaching a media to do an interview on something, and actually think about it like what's the next 6 months, and then you can define not just who you are, but what your next 6 months are going to look like, instead of having somebody else or a bunch of other people define that for you too. Yeah.
Thank you. And Maryanne, maybe we'll do a bit of wishful thinking. You and I were talking the other day about how in the independent space in Australia, it's, if it wasn't for patronage, to be honest, we'd both be a little bit stuck right now. It's very difficult to make a living writing without, if you want to do journalism without the constraints of working in the mainstream, there aren't a lot of options at the moment with who to write for or, at least get paid by. So if you could wave a magic wand, how would you change the media environment in Australia? Good to know. It's good to just have a North Star to fix on.
I think with legacy media having lied and misled the public for so long, there's a much bigger space for independent journalists to work now. And I was actually quite to work independently because I didn't have those constraints where my executive producer was telling me to remove that interview, it's too controversial, and dull it down, and if somebody says something, you've got to get somebody else to say something else to undermine it so we've got balance. I don't have to deal with that anymore. I was really quite excited about the prospect of being an independent journalist for those reasons. But there were other challenges that I wasn't quite expecting, and funding is a big thing. Trying to get the work back into mainstream is very difficult. Trying to sustain yourself on scholarship subscriptions on Substack is very difficult. I mean, there's some very successful journalists that are doing it and can work full-time and even have teams behind them, but I haven't reached that point yet. Another challenge I didn't expect or think of was that an independent journalist doesn't give you the power to submit a media inquiry and get an immediate response or even get an interview, because I think that I had so many years of the luxury of saying, we'd like to do an interview with you, and they're like, yes, whatever you want. What can we do to make this happen?
There are some government departments that actually won't deal with anyone who's not, they say the term is a recognised or a reputable is another one I've seen. Queensland government won't actually with anyone who's not mainstream media at all. So, and they don't tell you that. You have to call and call and call and call, and eventually they'll say, yeah, we don't talk to you.
Yeah, well, so I was actually told in an email, I had been hassling the FDA for about 2 years, and they came to me a year ago, and they said, look, we've just been inundated with media inquiries. We're prioritising our media inquiries. We're only responding to established media outlets. So then I went back and forth to determine what's established, and I knew that I could to the BMJ, so that they considered established, and I think maybe Epoch Times was the other established media outlet that they were willing to respond to. But if I said, I'm writing for Maryanne Demasi reports, they're like, who? And then I just wouldn't get a response. And done that quite a lot to me too. The other challenge is when you're on your own, you're putting Freedom of Information Act requests, they're costly, they come back redacted, you can't do anything with them. That was a waste of money. So they're resources that you can't afford to lose, and you don't notice that when you're in media. So yeah, they're the challenges: the funding, the access to the interviews, and the expense of.
So would you hope to
investigated.
see maybe more small publishers, for example?
Yeah, I
More
think
small,
so.
Yeah.
And it's hard to expect that people are going to support my work because I'm not a news service. I just do in-depth investigative pieces that have a very strong medical scientific slant. So I've got a niche audience, and not everybody's going to want to see that every week, day in, day out. And once you start deciding that you want to support, or maybe even 10 Substackers, it starts to add up the cost. So it'd be great if we could all just get together. One publication and have a salary and not worry that, we're not having the strong output there is, because the luxury
And work
of,
as a team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Luxury, what media outlet allows a journalist nowadays to work on a story for 2 or 3 months and not worry that they're not producing anything? That's that.
Yeah.
So that if I had to wave my magic wand, it would to be part of a society where we could take our time, investigate properly, and have adequate funding.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to throw it out to you guys now to ask questions. So I don't know your name, and then I'll come to you out second. So yes, thank you.
Hi, I have a lot of contact with Austria, and my girlfriend is always sending me some programs, and it's called Service TV. It's just a TV broadcasting system or alternative over there. And up to recently, I was able to watch it, but then it stopped on Telegram, so it got frozen, and now I can't anymore. So we tried it with emails, clicking on the link directly, nothing is being blocked. And if I translate it, it comes up the picture with the content is not available in your country. It doesn't even say Australia. It's not available in your country. So there must be a level of control even above.
Possibly, or is it? I know that ABC's programs are not available in some other countries, and I don't have access to some American programs. It's closed. But it is possible that some programs are geo-blocked. But if you're saying that you had access and now you don't have access, I'm not actually.
Sorry, at first I stopped first on Telegram, and then I still was able to click on the link, and I don't know, YouTube or whatever, and now it doesn't work at all anymore.
Right. I don't know what happened, but I know that there was a period of time at the ABC where we were geo-blocking programs, so users couldn't watch them.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question about what Maryanne was just saying about having a sort of a common ground or a common entity or an organization where you can actually be part of. And the reason I'm saying to, say, for example, subscribe to your channel, which I am a subscriber of, I was actually confused because Substack, I was actually confused, how does this whole thing work? Do I just pay an annual subscription and then I can access all these people who are actually doing such a wonderful job writing? But actually it wasn't like
Be the Spotify model, which I would actually prefer.
That's right.
I wish Substack did that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So my question was, I mean, there's so many wonderful people who are actually doing such a great job, writing on Substack. Would it not be possible, like people like yourself, talk to the CEOs or owner or whoever runs Substack and ask them, could we not have a and have a subscription base like that? And that would mean it would work so well for you guys as well as for everybody else who wants to read some articles. Sorry. But they find that, paying $50 for Maryanne, $50 for Rebekah, that's a lot of money. Whereas if they model, they can read yours, everybody else's, and they can get onto it. So that would be a good way to look at it, is my view.
Just with that, talking of challenges, I've noticed, even though I get the freedoms of being able to do want and investigate for as long as I want, whenever I want. There are moments where you do feel like you might be beholden to your paid subscribers, because I do stories that might irritate some of my paid subscribers, as I have done this week, where I talked about legacy media in the election victory of Trump. And what I tried to do was talk about how the media just constantly lied to people, and for example, they ran interference for Biden and his mental acuity and kept telling people attack, and he was vigorous, and anybody with functioning eyes and ears can see that it's not the case. So people don't trust the legacy media and they go to alternative platforms, and it essentially played into Trump's hands. Whether you love him or you hate him, he is a master at strategy of the media, and it ended up working for him. It helped him with the legacy media not really covering the election fairly. And there were studies that were done that showed across the 3 left legacy media networks, Kamala Harris got 78% favourable coverage, 15% of Trump. So it was clear that it was happening, but my subscribers, who are generally left-leaning academics, were outraged by the article, saying that it was an endorsement of Trump, and how dare I do something like that. He's a misogynistic, rapist, convicted felon who led an insurrection. And I mean, I've tried to explain that it wasn't an endorsement of Trump, but rather an indictment of the legacy media. But politics just gets people really quite emotional about it. Anyway, the point of that story was they felt that they would punish me by unsubscribing. So I lost a whole series of paid subscribers as a result. And so I can see how the paid subscriptions can then make journalists say certain things or take certain positions or run certain stories to gain popularity, gain a tribe. And sometimes they might lose their way and not really abide by editorial policies and the things that guide proper journalism, because they've got a subscriber base they need to write to.
What's the same problem that you were speaking to?
Well, I think the internet has exacerbated that for all outlets, including mainstream outlets, because under the old models, where you might have in an Australian city, you might have 1 to 2 papers, and you've got the, I'm old, so like the 4 channels. You had pretty well duopolies, and the advertisers would have to come to you to reach a mass audience, and outlets then would have to also cater for a mass audience. So they would try not to offend people on the left, not to offend people on the right. They would try to get as many people watching as possible, and it also meant, to some extent, if some people had a hissy fit, it wasn't so bad because they had this broad audience. But now that the internet, and we have millions of different sources of information, and it's moved more to a subscriber or a niche sort of base, and so outlets are catering more specifically for their audience, and it's because, of course, they're basically pandering often and giving their audience what they want. And to me, one of the most disgraceful exhibitions of that was during COVID, when The Age basically sacked Leunig and took him off and really that was because their feral reading, was anti. I won't say anything. He was against vaccines. I won't use the.
I think it was anti-mandates.
Anti-mandate.
Anti-mandate.
Yeah, but anyway, he upset their readership, and I think Gay Alcorn, was the editor at that stage. She actually just said it. He wasn't in line with the readership, and that was a sad day in a newspaper like The Age, whether they. And Leunig, he was like an institution. So if they could axe him just because they were getting, this feral reaction, who's to their news, basically to keep those people happy.
During the Second World War, can you hear me? Yeah. During the Second World War, either Goebbels or Hermann Goering said, if you want to control the masses, tell a lie, make sure it's a big lie. Right?
Safe and effective.
20 years ago, No to Violence Victoria were warned about their ideological approach to family violence, and they should drop the ideological approach and move into a forensic approach to see what's really causing it. And it was predicted that things would slowly get worse, which they did do early this year. About July this year, then I was still the CEO, Philip Ripper of No to Violence Victoria, which is the peak body for Australian family violence organisations. And Patricia Carvallis, which I was surprised with, really pushed him hard to get an answer as to why they weren't taking drugs, unemployment and other social issues into context with family violence. And he didn't want to answer the question, but he reluctantly turned around and said, no, I nearly ran off the road when I heard it, it doesn't fit our ideology. Now that's a massive, admission on the wrong thing the last 22, 25 years. I don't know, when I worked in the pilot program at Ballarat, and I started to question the ideology, because I come from a forensic background with the federal government in fraud investigation initially before I went to uni. And I said, look, there's something wrong with this. We've got blokes who are suicidal, they're going home more violent program, and that's Australia-wide. And I was promptly told I didn't know what I was bloody talking about if I wanted my job to keep my mouth shut. So the point is, do we have to get to a critical mass before we actually reach sensibility with some of these things?
Can I just say on that, because it's the statement on the ASF website is to promote scientific critique. And there's just not enough, proper scientific critique and analysis of what goes on. There's not enough of that. We are settled into orthodoxies. Case, started at least 20 years ago, and they've become baked in and accepted, and you can get cancelled another very, very quickly. But it's an available thing for this organisation or this group to do, is to really push scientific critique.
I saw recently 60 Minutes possible domestic violence killings that have been covered up by police, which is a subject of interest to me, because I have people coming to me, mothers sometimes, but often their sons who don't get any attention, and this is all interested in watching this story. And then I saw in between all the Channel 9 presenters were talking about some new domestic violence campaign that the government was running, and I realised this is just advertorial. They run this story because the government's given them a lot of money and are doing this, have a particular message to push, and quite disappointing.
Go ahead.
This is a question about fact checkers. It's an open question to the panel. I'll just for the story that many will remember. In October 22, in the European Parliament, a Dutch MEP, Rob Roos, questioned the Pfizer CEO who didn't turn up, Albert Bourla. So they got this woman called Janine Small from the UK, the European President on Developed Markets. And the question was, can you just simply say yes or no, Janine, does the Pfizer stop transmission? And she said, quote, no, because we were working at the speed of science. Now, the fact checkers went into overdrive because that's a true. And so what I've found with fact checkers is the false thing they do is put the word false up first. Then they manipulate the story to get their narrative of their paid audience, which is your banks and the big pharma. And I've had a fact checker correct themselves. I should have screen printed it, but they can malign good, truthful stories. And so my question is, who checks the fact checkers, and why isn't there something being done about them? Because to make them false even though they're true?
So there's this great myth that a lot of people seem to believe, that fact checkers are like a special class of people, like the high priests of truth with a capital T, who somehow know things. And it's obviously the biggest con ever. I know you've got things to say, I think, Andrew, but Professor Anne Toomey, in the constitutional law expert, sort of lifted the lid on fact-checking in the Senate inquiry on the misinformation bill. She said, well, I deal with fact-checkers a lot, and they're often kids out of university who put a question to me in a certain way. I respond to the question as it was phrased. They misunderstand what I said and use it to present the information in a way that's incorrect. And it turns out they were trying to get answered when it's rephrased in its original, phrased in its original format, which is not how they posed it to me, means a different thing as well. And she was highlighting that fact checkers are not subject matter experts and so often don't actually understand the information they're dealing with. And it was beautiful. It was funny and beautiful. Go ahead, Andrew.
I mean, well, who checks the fact checkers? I would say it's us and everyone in this room who does the work of interrogating or pushing back or criticizing and that. And people should think of that as their. I think especially a lot of the journalists throughout the pandemic, or people who are still doing all of that work. I think there are some larger scale attempts that people are trying to put together that will hold those fact checkers to account in real time. I think they are, what you were saying about that the vice president or the I saw those fact checks as well, and it was just like, what, this doesn't make any sense. And I think sometimes the whole idea is just to confuse you. And you just go, how could, she literally said it out loud, and you're saying, who are interpreting, well, they don't even necessarily say it's false or misleading, and they'll kind of do some very weird, I mean, it's what I imagine the tobacco industry would be doing. These things, they're all kind of tricks, except that they put fact check on there, and they have a kind of NGO, nice looking. It seems legit. I think at the same time, this industry has a lot less credibility than it did a couple of years ago. And to loop into the mis and disinformation bill, I'm actually extremely heartened and very pleasantly surprised, because I, again, even a month or so ago, we were really up against it, that in terms of the mis and disinformation bill. It's not a done deal, but if people haven't seen, there's now 4 crossbenchers who have come out against the bill. If they hold, then the bill can't get through. Someone please fact check me if that is
correct.
You have bias because we're working.
Yeah. Maryanne will fact check me later.
Okay, thanks. So that is really encouraging. The fact that there are progressive senators like Pocock pushing back as well, who will appeal to the audiences who often love fact. Love a good fact check. I think that has so much less credibility than it did 6, 12, 18, 24 months ago. So you're totally right, and I think we just need to keep pushing back and show that this is essentially propaganda. It's not legitimate fact-checking work at all.
I think check means stop in one, and that's generally what they're for, stopping facts. We're on the home ground of one of the more notorious fact-checking units, the RMIT, who also did work for the ABC. It was exposed, that during they basically only fact-checked the No campaign, and eventually that embarrassed, I think it was Facebook who ditched them. I actually remember that the ABC fact-check on the European Parliament, and it was an incredible piece of work, because it basically admitted, was he right? Does COVID not stop transmission? They basically admitted, yes, this is what he said within like the first few parts. And then they went on to say, but they never said that. And I was just sitting there, they never said it would stop transmission. And I was just, with my mouth.
Frank Chung.
Yes, they did.
did a really good clap back to that in news.com.au, and I hyperlink it into everything, and it was called Yes, They Said It Would Stop Transmission, and then he documented every single premier and CHO saying you need to get vaccinated to stop the spread. Well done, Frank.
The irony of that was when the FDA issued the emergency use authorization, in the final document, it said that it was unclear whether or not the vaccine stopped transmission because it wasn't tested, and they allowed the vaccine to be this information. So those of us that were looking at those documents closely knew from the very beginning that it didn't stop transmission because they never tested for it to stop transmission because it would just be too expensive and it would take too long, and the regulators let that slip by. So yeah, it was pretty stunning to hear. It was the basis of a mandate that, you know, you keep your community safe when it was clear that the vaccine didn't stop transmission.
I mean, they're incredible pieces of. I remember another one. You know, I was arguing with a friend of mine, and I said, "Do you know the inventor of the PCR test said it was not meant to be diagnostic?" And he sent me a Reuters fact check, and in the very top line it said, "We have to correct this and say that possibly he did mean that." So Reuters had to correct their own fact check to admit that yes. But then, of course, like all of them, they bore you into submission with pages and pages of obfuscation.
Experts saying there's no evidence because no one's tested for it.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of the kind of method is what you were saying about your press release, was that journalists go around looking for stories, and they go, because not that many people go to the fact check sites, but the journalists go to the fact check sites, and they then just amplify the fact check and continue to run the interference.
If they're looking to debunk a narrative, then
if they're looking
they've
to
got
debunk, which maybe their
to
editor has asked them.
Which, by the way, it's so just to highlight too. I mean, the problem is everyone in this room's the difference between a denial and a debunking. So there's a thing now where media will say that's been debunked, and what they mean is a 24-year-old fact checker said it's not true. And the TGA denied it, but then the fact checker will say the TGA debunked it. But the TGA never provided any evidence. Also just said, it's not true. And so it's just a chain of people going deny, deny, deny. And in a Substack I did on this, I put at the end a picture, a meme of Bill Clinton saying, I did not have sex with that woman, saying like there's a big difference between debunking, but the media tends to treat the two as the same, especially if it comes from a government agency or a fact checker.
One of my favourite headlines, and I might not get this quite correct, but it was everyone, you know, Israel is like 99% vaxxed, and everyone's still getting COVID. But that doesn't mean the vaccine. Yes, it does.
That's like people that are vaccine injured. They're like, well, that means the vaccine's working. Like, no.
Think how much worse it would have been if you hadn't got the vaccine.
Exactly. You would have died, obviously. Yeah. Eamon.
Yeah. Is it on? Yeah. I don't know many journalists, so I'm curious to get your insight on this. It's a genuine question, and I'm comfortable asking it in public because it's a room full of cookers. So you've mentioned Trusted News Initiative, you've mentioned propaganda, you've mentioned 5 reasons why the editors have done what they've done. Miranda Devine has been laptop from hell. She has been speaking publicly about the role of intelligence services in the media. People like Robert Epstein is talking about how Google was set up with intelligence services by blah, 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 for the reason of nudging propaganda warfare. You had the brigade, the 77th Brigade in the UK operating against anyone who spoke out across these, you know. So there's this understanding, in this sort of field of information warfare, 5th generation warfare, whatever they're talking about, people say the story is a more powerful weapon than the nuclear bomb. You guys are soldiers in this space. How many journalists are aware of the depth? It is not the editor concerned about commercial interests in any way, shape or form when it comes to significant stories. And this is being run from a level beyond that. Are many journalists way. The other one person I wanted to mention, just so I'm not making this up, is Udo Altkoff, who wrote, the German journalist who was the whistleblower exposing the links between high-level journalism and intelligence services across particularly the Anglophone world. Are journalists, are you guys aware, it hasn't been mentioned in all of the to that, the level of embeddedness of the intelligence services with all of the work that you guys do and the information that's put out to the public?
Yeah, so I've got a few points on that. So actually, I've just come from an event in Brisbane, which is a very large event, has about 70,000 people. We did a kind of a side event talking about mis and disinformation with about 30 people, half of which were mainstream media journalists and people who were involved in kind of the anti-disinformation industry. So essentially, it was kind of turned out to be extremely adversarial. Actually, it was all Chatham House rules, so I can't kind of tell you everything. But what I can tell you is that huge numbers of those people had absolutely no idea about half the stuff that was going on. I mean, there were a couple of missions of like, oh yeah, the whole Biden's thing. Maybe we made a little bit of a mess there. But you talk to them about the Hunter Biden laptop, for example, and they're still was that true? Like even after the New York Times and the Washington Post and everyone has actually still said that it is true. And so there's, on one level, people are in still, and I say that not necessarily saying that we also aren't. We always have to be very careful that we also aren't in an enormous bubble too. But and I because my background was kind of in these liberal left NGO circles, and I would go and talk to people that have absolutely no idea of any of this stuff that is happening. So one guy was set, because the laptop came up from a kind of large tech magazine. He was saying, oh, well, the web platforms did their best with the laptop. No one knew at the time, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, this will bring us back to the mis and disinformation bill. The Aspen Institute held a hack and leak tabletop exercise that involved the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, several universities, an anti-disinformation outfit called First Draft, and others, 2 months before the Miranda Devine Post story came out, and they essentially developed a day-by-day, this came out in the Twitter files, a day-by-day plan of how they would respond if theoretically a Hunter Biden laptop discussing the Burisma energy company in Ukraine came to light. So it's 2 months before, outside of the FBI and the intelligence services.
Just imagine if a story like this happened.
Yeah.
What would we do?
An actual conspiracy. All the emails are there. You can see the people who participated, which included a woman called Claire Wardle from First Draft, who was the organization co-wrote the mis and disinformation digital code for Digi that the mis and disinformation bill explicitly builds on. And Michelle Rowland will tell you that the mis and disinformation bill aims to provide an enforcement mechanism for that industry code that laptop suppression participated in.
Yeah, boom. Mic drop. Yes, and then we'll probably have to wrap up on this.
We welcome them because we know that they're normally China and Indonesia, right? And we say, you guys must be bored, but we hope that you're more enlightened, and we're hoping that not many of you have been vaccinated, But yeah, it was clear, and our tech guys said their involvement was so obvious, they were so clumsy about it. But all they've social media anyway, but we feel that they're doing more monitoring who we're contacting, who we're trying to get lined up for interviews, and all that sort of stuff. So if Club Grubbery's drawing that attention, you have a couple of old has-beens. I mean, John's he sits his laptop on his washing machine, and I tell him spin cycle before we record. And my computer sits on top of a coffee table with a stack of books, and it's so unsophisticated, but if they're involved and interested in that, then we really are in a bad way. So, yeah, they are involved as far as we know.
I know a guy who went for a job at ASF. In the interview, they slapped down a copy of a major national broadsheet and said, which stories did we place in that? So, obviously intelligence is often closely intertwined with the press. US, it was actually, they had, I think it was called Operation Mockingbird, where they deliberately cultivated, including, as I recall, the famous Washington Post editor Ben Bradley. He answered to the CIA. Just as one little cooker conspiracy theorists out there, my understanding is our E-Safety Commissioner, her first major job interview was with the CIA.
She turned the position down, she says.
She says. And the reason she turned the position down is because she then couldn't tell she didn't want to be able to not tell her friends and family about her work. So she didn't want to be censored. That's why she turned it down. Supposedly. Purported.
It's 5 o'clock, but apparently we're allowed to run a few minutes over. So, Nikki.
Few years, there's been only a handful of media who've been pursuing truth, and you're nearly all of them, or most of them, or a big number of them, and I want to thank you for your relentless pursuit of truth. Get to write about justice one day. And these guys have been incredible, and thank you for everything you do, despite all the obstacles and the pain and the pressure and the independence, which means lack of funds. So I'm sure everyone in this room too will pay for your Substacks.
Thank you, Nikki.
I just want to gush a little bit too about independent media. I think the best coverage of the COVID period is being done by Rebekah and Maryanne and various others, and Graham Hood. That's that mainstream outlets should be doing and hasn't been doing. And when I meet them, I'm quite starstruck. It's like an all-stars here, and so
ASF
I'm very grateful.
All-Stars.
And of course, I haunt their work, hoping to find something I can pinch. Yeah, what all media do.
Well, that's actually, that's something that I had thought we might talk about, but we didn't get to, is how the ecosystem works at the moment, where essentially we break stories, and then mainstream, if they see an appetite for that, will then pinch it, which I don't exactly have a problem with, in the sense that I want out there. It's just that, it would be nice if someone paid us to do that role. Yeah. We had another one at the back.
This is a question probably mostly for Brian. I imagine that there are a number of what we might call COVID enforcers who are getting a bit nervous now. I wondered if they are already planning ahead for their defence when they come against a credible expose of what they have done. And if they are, and if they came to you theoretically, what would you advise? What would we expect a good tactic to be, or mechanism that we might watch play out?
Right. First of all, the first part of the question is an easy one to answer. It is almost certainly the case that, and there's just so many organisations, pharma companies, just one of them, that would be forward with a very serious view about how they might need to position themselves and manage what might come out. In terms of what's the playbook for this, is to get a big organisation, and the stuff's going to come out. You write down everything that you think is going to come out, and then work through what are you going to do, what are you going to say, and what are you going to say ranges from nothing to you're wrong to mea culpa, but like it would be unquestionable. People are already thinking about that.
Now, I'm taking Nick's cue here as in terms of how many more questions we're going to take. Oh, don't put me in that position. No, you choose. So this is the last one.
Okay. Seems okay. In 1974, Robin Williams convinced ABC Radio to let the science unit run a program modelled on David Suzuki's wonderful program in Canada. Our show was called The Science Show. It was followed by others. Occam's Razor was a particularly good. Then we got Radio National. We also got a guy called Dr. Norman Swan. Dr. Norman Swan, thank you. Dr. Norman Swan was basically employed as the medical journalist for The Science Show. Now, we all know that during the COVID, whatever it was, he produced a show called CoronaCast. In my opinion, he was almost criminally irresponsible in some of the information he gave. Now, my question is this. Up until this event, people took Radio National very seriously. We believed what we were told in all good faith. It's wrong. Can you see how we can correct this? Is the way forward?
Here. I have a comment. I just wrote something recently related to this, but more about the academic and NGO space, which is that the institutions failed in so just completely across the spectrum, like everything from unions to academia to obviously politicians that were probably failing beforehand. Anyway, so we won't count them. And so where does and it's also, I think, one of the big problems in Australia is there was so little compared to other places in the US or even the UK. So where do you get the new leadership? Because I think what not just justice, but actually renewal looks like is that anyone who is in a senior position, and particularly a top position, in any institution or any institution weight at that time should not be in a position anymore. They need to all be gone. And new leadership needs to be developed, but where do you get the new leadership from when you have such a dearth of options in that right? And I think it's a generational bit of work, essentially, maybe points actually to the work Gigi and others are doing with the academia. But I think it's a huge project, essentially, to build a new generation of people, because I think, actually, if you look at a lot of the voting for in the US in the recent election, and actually in the recent German regional elections, a lot of very to 24 to 28 are shifting in a very different political direction. And in some ways, it's like, well, it'd be a shame to have to wait for all the 18 and 21-year-olds to, finish their PhDs or whatever it is that they need to do. But I think actually that for me is actually the answer. I think a whole new generation, and it's a huge amount of work. So once we kill the bad stuff, which is still some work to be done there, the next, and simultaneously, and then expand essentially this basically new generation of people who are going to restore institutional credibility of our societies.
In science, there's a saying: "Science progresses one funeral at a time." I think it's the same. The same goes for media.
She said it much more quickly.
I'd like to point out that I've gone after Swan a number of times, and I was the one who picked up out of I picked it out where I get most of my stories, but where he said Kimberly Kitchen probably had her heart attack because she had COVID, and she'd never had COVID. So I went after him on that, and on a number of other occasions, mainly because I spent a Christmas at my parents' and ABC watches, and it was just 24/7 COVID porn, fear porn, and there wasn't even any COVID at that stage. They were looking for it in the wastewater. That's how desperate they were to find. But really, they're just,
I never want to see another picture ever again.
They're just scaring stiff their boomer audience, and that's what I view Swan as, an opportunist who took that. Well, this might be on tape, but who took that opportunity to scare his boomer audience.
I'll just never forget him saying in 2021, "There are no unknown side effects around the corner." black box medication, where black triangle, which means we don't know what all the side effects are. Yeah, I just can never take him seriously forevermore after that. Yeah. So we have to wrap up. There were some people with questions. I guess we'll mingle. If you want to come and ask a question, feel free. So thank you. Thank you.
For further information on ASF, go to scienceandfreedom.org.